Okay, good evening. Shall we start the lecture? For those who attend the lecture on Zoom, can you confirm with me whether you're able to see my share screen and also listen to my speaking? Okay, thank you very much. After a very brief introduction last week, and this week I would like to provide more context before we go into the discussion of various aspects of analyzing the city. So in this lecture, I'll try to do several things. First is to trace back to the origin of cities and try to link up what we call the pre-industrial and industrial city. I have already mentioned a little bit that cities, in fact, is not a new invention. So we have cities many, many years ago. But cities in the modern era, what we call in the industrial era, is completely different from cities before the Industrial Revolution. And there is also some difference between cities in the North American countries, in Europe, and also in Asia. So there is also something I want to highlight. And in my discussion, I also want to identify some factors that lead to the development of pre-industrial and industrial city. That will have some connection with our subsequent discussion in other lectures about the development of modern cities and the problem, the issues, and the factors that are associated. So I'll start from history, looking at cities in the very remote, distant past, and try to describe the development of the city along a chronological timeline. And I will cover the European city, the Western city, and also the Chinese city briefly. And then I'll try to point out the driving forces for pre-industrial city development, and also why there is a rise in modern cities some centuries ago. And also lastly, to differentiate modern city in the United States and China as some kind of pretext to our subsequent discussion, because they are very different. In fact, cities has a very long history. As long as we begin to settle, early human being became to settle, and cities, in fact, begin to take shape many, many years ago. Although in those days we cannot call it a city, but at least the human being at that time has already so-called a cluster within a small spatial area, and more important is to engage in social interaction, and more importantly into cooperation for survival and further development. But we cannot call it a city because there's nothing resemble the city nowadays. But in fact, if we look at some archaeological sort of evidence, something we call the cities with a substantive concentration of population and doing something that is the most important, other than agriculture. So in fact, the first cities can be traced back to around 10,000 years ago. Of course, I mean, we only depends on the very limited archaeological evidence. And in fact, in 6000 BC, in the areas now belongs to Turkey, we also found some trace of very early cities. And whereas what we call the four early civilization, those civilization in the Mesopotamia and in between the two rivers, the twin river, what we call the Tigris and the Euphrates, that is so-called modern Iraq, and also Egypt in the river Nile, and along the river, particularly the delta of river Indus, and of course, China Yellow River is also one of the origin of civilization. And we found substantive evidence of cities that bear some function similar to that of nowadays, although in terms of scale, they are very different. And not forgot to mention, in fact, the more important development in city was found in Greece. Is about 2,000 years ago. In Athens, in Sparta, these are the cities that have quite advanced civilization and functions. But of course, in that remote past, Rome, and the capital of the Roman Empire, was one of the most sophisticated cities at that time. So it's about 2,000 years ago. But these are the very early states of the city. But unfortunately, particularly in Europe or in this, what we call the Midwest, there is a very long period that in fact, the cities haven't been developed on the basis of the scales and the function of the earlier cities. Because if you are familiar with history of some Western civilization, there is quite a long period, what we call the Dark Age. In the Dark Age, in fact, after the Roman Empire fell, they broken down into so-called some other empire, for instance, the East Roman Empire, but in the proper of Europe, the cities, in fact, at that time decayed because of the fermentation of all the ruling fractions and the rise of the feudal power. So that at that time, not only big cities began to nearly disappear, and the power centers, in fact, has shifted from, for instance, in early city of Rome and Athens, to the more rural area, which is ruled by the so-called feudal landlords. And that period was quite long, in fact, nearly 1,000 years of that sort of Dark Age. It's not until in Europe we have the Renaissance. One thing the Renaissance bring in significant watershed to the development of city is the rise of a few, what we call city-state. Noticeably in northern Italy, Venice, and Florence. These two cities are developed on the basis of trade. And trades are being concentrated in those spots. When they do business, they have to have some kind of entrepot function. And more important is the concentration of merchant class in those cities. In northern Italy, when they have the access to the Baltic seas, and then the export can be traveled to other parts of Europe. And at that time, the power centers have been concentrated on very scattered feudal power spread across the countryside in many now the European countries. Those city-states are relatively independent in terms of the political power. But because of its significance in the economy, because of the flourishing of of trade, the merchant class so-called emerged in power. One important difference between the merchant class and the more traditional feudal power is the format of their wealth. So in the feudal powers, their wealth rested in the ownership of land, and also the deployment of men and women on those lands for agriculture, and then they extract the rents, or they even employ sort of slave in working in those lands. But for the merchants, they have no interest in land because their business relied on doing business with trade. So they have all the movable so-called wealth. They have the ships to do the import and export, and also they have all their commodities, which are all movable. So this is a very significant difference between the source of power in the past and the rise of, at that time, the modern class with a different so-called power base. But one very important group of people associated with trade is something what we call the guilds. They are, in fact, trade organizations that organize production of some very primitive industrial sort of products. That's not new, in fact, that's not new. In earliest, later on, we'll return to the earlier city. Why we have earlier city? Because we need other economic activities besides agriculture. So guilds, in fact, is originated from those lineage. But in those so-called independent city-states that rely on trade, this kind of guilds are becoming important because when you have trade, you need ships. When you have ships, you need shipbuilding, you need ship maintenance. And if they want to travel further, they need all those technologies and knowledge in navigating the sea. And they sell not only agricultural products, but also industrial products. So increasingly, there's a concentration of artisans that produce that industrial product for export. And in Europe, they are being organized in the form of trade organizations. So the trade organization, they control the means of production, but more important is they regulate the exchange of those so-called materials and products. And one also important function is to reproduce and manage the workers in those trades. So if you have the chance to travel to some West European countries, for instance, to Italy, to a lesser extent to France, but you can still find a lot of those traces in the Czech Republic, capital of Prague. So in the city center, they have all the squares, they have some buildings that have a long history of those trade organizations. And these are becoming the center of power in those independent so-called city-states, which some of them still survive now. Of course, I mean the site, not the organization. So they organize the city-states into districts, into streets that sell the same commodity, which has an economy of scales, and also is better to organize and to control. So these independent states plow the seeds of modern so-called city development. But in China, the history of the development of the cities are very different, We have cities in the Qing Dynasty, in the Han Dynasty, but those cities are usually being created as administrative centers. So that is very different from the European states in the Dark Age, because they are being ruled by the feudal power, which built a castle in the middle of nowhere, and they don't want to have cities. Whereas in China, it's very different because we have a united dynasty as early as 2000 years ago, and all those rules are being exercised from the power center, which were the cities. So the earliest development of cities in China are all administrative centers. So in fact, this impact still carry forward until today. So all those cities, they are important to a power center as administrative city. Whereas it's quite different. In fact, later on we'll differentiate in Europe and the United States, because they may have separate power administrative center and then economic and business center, which belong to different cities. But in China, we usually, of course, we have some exception. We usually will merge them into one city because of the integration of economic and political power. Whereas in Europe, because of the relative differentiation of that, because when it's foreign, they are the trade center, but they have no political power. The political power belongs to the feudal lords, which resettle in the castles, very far away from those cities. So that they used to have different power center, whereas in China, as early as 2000 years ago, this too has already been integrated. But an important development of a center happened begin from the Han Dynasty because of international trade, and particularly about the development of the Silk Road. So because of the Silk Road, we need to develop cities which have special function to trade. But this special function can also be twofold. One is facilitating trading by providing logistics. But the other is also administered by the state to provide protection. So all those important trade cities, they are also important military centers. So you may be more familiar than myself with the early history about the Han Dynasty and the Tang dynasties. All the big cities in the West, in fact, they are also very important military outposts. So besides the logistics supply, they also will provide protection with very intense control of the state in terms of the concentration of military power at those spots. So that serves very important function, not just to protect trade, but also to guide the frontier of the country against invasions, particularly from the north and also from the west. Whereas in the Sui Dynasty, Tang Dynasty, and Song Dynasty, the Silk Route has expanded. More commodity have been traded, and it also have developed some so-called sea routes. And of course, the Grand Canal is also one important so-called communication route within China. And in the Song Dynasty, they begin to expand the trade to the Southeast Asia. And with the Grand Canal, it facilitates trade between the south and northern part of China. And that have a big impact on the internal trade. And because of that, along the Grand Canal, there are few cities being developed to facilitate trade. But at that time, most of the strategic commodity has been controlled by the state. And in fact, this was quite persistent across different dynasties. So, but of course, I mean, they still allow some private merchant to have trading, but there is only just the signed products. The most strategic and important commodity are all controlled by the state in various dynasties in various forms. And the Ming and the Qing dynasty, we see the city being expanded. And because of the wide territory of the Qing dynasty, there are cities set up all over China, which serve just like what the country did for centuries and millennia. The concentration of economic power and administrative military power within those cities. But one important thing about the Qing dynasty, it is very rapid expansion, both to the south and also to the north. I think apart from the Yun dynasty ruled by the Mongolia, which is not so-called quite the same as other dynasties because they are short and also the way they rule the country was very different. Qing will adopt most of the convention of the earlier dynasties and all those so-called cultural heritage. But the development of the city is very different at that time. But of course, more of you know that one turning point of the development of city happened in the 19th century because of the invasion of Western power. And then a number of new cities have been built. And those cities began their life as treaty ports to open up China to the trade from the West. And that is a very important sort of turning point of the development of cities in China, because those treaty ports from its very first origin, from its functions, and also from the span of control of the state were very different from the more traditional city that are built by the imperial power. And so those legacy carry on to influence the different route of development of cities in China in modern days. And important impact of the opening of those treaty ports are the over-reliance on trade, and that will create a lot of imbalance in terms of the trade balance and also in terms of the political power of control of those cities. So I will not label this on that because I would say that you're very fluent on those developments. But when we just talk about cities, as a very long history, traced back 10,000 years ago, and big cities already emerged 2,000 years ago. So what are the main difference between cities in that sort of remote pre-industrial era and those in the industrial era? So first, let us describe some of the driving force of pre-industrial city. So now we have understanding of modern city, particular cities in this part of Asia and particularly in mainland China. We have the conception that the bigger the city, the better it is. Because of the economy of scale, because of all those, a list of 100 things that you will mention, that the bigger the city, it will be more favorable. But in fact, this is exactly the constraining super factors in city development in the past. Because size and density of cities in the pre-industrial eras have a very different consideration instead of nowadays. So why cities in the past cannot grow big? So you can imagine if we have a city of the size of the smallest city in China now, for instance, we have 100,000 people in a city. So in fact, you need to feed that 100,000 people, and those 100,000 people, they do not do farming. If they did not do farming, where the food come from? So in fact, size and density would have an opposite connection with cities in the past and city now, because the city now, if it is big, we have economies of scale. Whereas city, if in the past they are big, they face an insurmountable problem of how to feed those sort of people in the city. And what do they do? What did they do in the city? So size and density, in fact, is a constraint in those days, because first, you need to have economic development to a stage that you can produce a lot of surplus food to feed those people who do not do farming. If they do not do farming, they need to be supported by others. And the second is, the more higher concentration of the city, the bigger the city, all the negative problems that are associated with modern cities will be 100 or 1,000 or 1,000 times more serious in cities in the past than now. Not to mention cities 1,000 years ago, even 300 years ago, in the biggest cities in Europe, France, Paris, in England is London. They are very famous of city being the dirtiest city in the world. Because you can imagine, if I have a high concentration of people in an area, how to solve the problem of power supply, of water supply? How to solve the problem of the waste disposal? So it makes all the environment extremely dirty and stingy. In fact, cities in the distant past, in the pre-industrial era, they serve some specific function. We need people who do not do agriculture because we need people to produce some tools and instruments that support agriculture. Not just support agriculture, to support two other things that will facilitate the ruling class. The first, just like China, we need some administrator to rule the country. So those administrators are better be concentrated within a small area so that communication and the command can be more efficient. And the second thing is about the military force. So you need the concentration of soldiers in a small area in order to offer protection for the ruling class. So that's why those who live in cities, they are functional in various sense. Of course, it's to the ruling of the country and also to the benefit and protection of the ruling class. So this concentration of surplus of food is perhaps the most fundamental factors that drive the development of cities. If you do not have surplus food, nobody can afford not doing sugar farming. So if we cannot support population that didn't do farming, you cannot have big city. And it also depends on the class structure of the society. Cities in China have been created because of we need to support a big brigade of administrators and bureaucrats to rule the country. Whereas in Egypt, they also have big cities, relatively big cities, because of religious so-called functions. So you need a lot of priests, in fact, to provide legitimacy for the pharaohs to rule over the country. And various forms of state organization also would have an impact on whether you need a big city or you do not need a big city. So that's why in that age, because of the fragmentation of all the ruling fractions, all the feudal laws, they only rule over a relatively small piece of land. So they do not need a big brigade of soldiers or administrators. So they don't need cities, in fact, to sustain that. Whereas in China, the Imperial China, because of the vast area of the countries, and they need a relatively high concentration of manpower, of administrators and soldiers, artisans, in order to support the governance of the city. So in fact, there are several theories that try to explain the development, the emergence, the development, and the expansion of cities. First is about economic theories, and because of technology, because of trade specialization. So in fact, as I just mentioned before, in Venice and in Florence, you need to build ships and bigger ships, so that you need some specialized artisans to do that. And they can only do it if you have a concentration of those specialized manpower within a small area to do that production. And trade is also a big driving force for that, because for trade, you need a lot of division of labor on that. So you have the logistics, you have all the business negotiations, you have those who have to take care of accountings and finance, and they are all specialized labor. And they did not sort of do a living on farming, and they will concentrate in city in doing that. And the other is military theory, I just mentioned, because of the need for defense. So you need the concentration of soldiers within a small area, what we call a city. So usually they will be sort of deployed within the four walls of the city, so that they can provide the best sort of defense for the city. And associated with military production of instruments, you need a lot of artisans in doing that. So, and also craftsmen as well. And the other is, I just mentioned about Egypt. Egypt is, we have big city because they need to maintain a elaborated religious sort of organization. And those religious class, in fact, they are not just doing sort of religion. So in Egypt and partly in the Roman Empire, and after that in that age, the church itself is the generation and the transmission of knowledge. So in fact, the priests are those what we call educated class that have the function of transmitting knowledge to younger generations. So they would only find it more efficient and effective if they have a high concentration within city. And the fourth theory is what we call the hydraulic theory. It applies partly to China, and also in countries that relied on an elaborate system of irrigation. Because of the irrigation, so you need people to design, to maintain. So those artisans and those who plan and coordinate those irrigation sort of projects, they are better concentrate in cities. But of course, they are smaller cities because they have to close to the agricultural hinterland, where the irrigation system is most elaborated. So in fact, how about modern city? Modern cities, in fact, is the product of the Industrial Revolution. So I would say this is almost common sense to many of you that we have industries. Industry will be better placed in cities. But in fact, the development of industry and the development of cities, they go hand in hand. But the relation between the technological development, the development of industry, and the expansion of the cities are being connected in a quite organic way. Because if we only have the advancement in technology, there is only a necessary condition for the development of industry, but not a sufficient condition. Because when you have the technology being introduced, there's still a very big gap between how the technology can be applied to actual production. Whereas even if you find a way to transfer it into actual production, how can you build a factory for that production and then expand the factory? You need manpower. You need manpower, because without manpower, of course, I mean, you can remember, you have to recall that earliest industrial revolution, most of the machine, in fact, they have to be handled by humans. So you need a lot of workers to handle that. Where's the worker come from? Where the worker come from? So you can imagine that even you have the factory, and at the same time, you have a lot of farmers who do farming. How can you attract those farmers to the factory? Farmers are very conservative. How could they dare to take the risk, abandon their farming, and then go to the cities where they know nobody, they are not uncertain about the future. So in fact, even we now take it as granted about this three go in hand with each other, the actual connection is far more complicated with the logic I just mentioned. So in fact, this three, technology, invention of new technology, application to production, and then also building factory to expand the production, they are being connected in a very interesting way. Because of course, we know that the advancement in technology will improve efficiency. But I was just briefly mentioned earlier, that efficiency improvement cannot be materialized unless you can build a big factory. But before you build a big factory, how can you ensure that you have sufficient workers to run those factories? So in fact, the story didn't begin in city. Of course, I mean, we all know that very well in recent history of China, but you may not associate this kind of development with the development of cities, for instance, in Europe in that time, in the 17th century, in the 18th century. Because what happened in China in the 80s, in the rural area, and European country in the 17th and 18th century are not quite the same, although the results are the same. Because the development of technology would first, in fact, not being applied in cities, in industry, but in agricultural production. Because you can imagine, what is the red line of people at that time? It's not in the factories, it's on the farming land. So if I have the technology, help me to improve efficiency of production, and then I can earn more, and I can becoming rich. So the advancement in technology first, in fact, being applied to agricultural production, but with the improvement in efficiency of agricultural production, you generate a lot of surplus manpower in the countryside. So that is exactly what happened in the 80s in countryside in China. Although in China, it's not because of the advancement in technology, is the advancement in ownership of production. But the result is the same. You generate a lot of surplus manpower. And those surplus manpower, they have no way to go. So if there were some new opportunity in factories, in cities, that will become a focus of attraction of those surplus manpower to cities to work in the factory. But in fact, like farmers in the 80s who moved to cities, they were not better off. They were not better off. Many of them, in fact, they are worse off because of the insecurity in jobs, because of the low salary, and more important is because of the very appalling living condition. And safety concern in factories, they are all the concern in the 80s and 90s in the peasant worker of China, but it's also at the same time in the 17th and 18th century in England or in other sort of European countries. But they have no choice. They have no choice. So the factories, many of them, in fact, they are being built up on the basis of those old workshops. Because in Europe, there are already a tradition of workshops in cities. And with the advancement of technology, there are gradual change in the production mode of those workshops and turn into factories. But unlike the factory, we have now all automatic, we have all those super efficient machines. Most of the factories at that time was so-called managed by human workers. Because of the help of the machine, they improve the efficiency. And that is a gradual sort of process. But there's also one thing very important. Why the Industrial Revolution takes shape in Europe and can expand on that basis. And we can trace to the contribution of those merchants. Those merchants, in fact, they generate their wealth not from agriculture, but from trade. So now they can see if they can improve the efficiency of production of what we call the industrial products, it will help them to do more trade. So some of them, in fact, shift their investment not just on trade and logistics, but in technology and in the factories. So many of them eventually become capitalists. And this will change the political power structure of many countries. And eventually they replace the feudal rulers as the real sort of ruler of the country in many European states. Modern cities, when they emerged first in Europe, in fact, most of those cities, they build up mostly on spots that already have a high concentration of population. Not necessarily city, but with a highly populated sort of countryside. So that it's easier for the peasants to move to the cities and work for the factories. So then this will have a connection with the already developed cities in Europe. Take, for example, in Italy, it's also Venice and Florence who become the earlier center for industrial development. And factories are also being built when the cost of production or the cost of logistics or the cost of power is so-called the most efficient. So that's why many cities are built along rivers. Rivers is not only facilitate trade, logistics, it will also generate sort of power, The river flow, and then they can turn the turbine. And if you have the steam engine, you also need a lot of sort of water supply. So it's close to the sort of water route, river route at the very start. But later on, when train locomotive was invented, many of those factories, they are being concentrated along those transportation routes and particularly close to the railway terminals. And in fact, all the prime sites in those big cities, they are being occupied by factories. So even now in many European cities, of course, London is an exception because of its so-called other kind of development. If you go to some English cities like Manchester, like Leeds, or like Liverpool, you can still see a lot of half abandoned or not fully utilized industrial site around the railway terminal. Some are regenerated and converted to other uses, but many are not. You can still see the trace of that. So that is most of the spatial location of the industry along those transportation routes like port and the railway stations. And around them, you can also see trace of so-called slum housing, cheap housing that are provided for the workers who work in those factories. So of course, the earlier stage of those modern cities, they have a lot of problems. So in fact, those problems reemerged in China in the 80s and 90s when we have a large-scale migration from the rural center to some of the urban centers. And many of those cities, those problems still linger today in some big Chinese cities. Whereas you can imagine in the 18th and 19th century, because of that scales of migration. Of course, the scale is not comparable to that of China, but compared with the history of the population movement in Europe, the scale of movement were already very high. So they create a lot of social problems. The first social problem that emerged in those European cities is the social control of those what we call the proletariat, because they have nothing to lose, because most of them, they are landless farmers who mass exodus to cities to look for ways of survival. So like many of the peasant workers in the early 90s in China, they dare to work for anything, but also they fear nothing. So that's why social control is become a very, very big issue in those cities. And because of the sudden influx of migrants to cities, the public services cannot be calibrated. So there is also the problems in the 90s and the early 20th centuries in many big Chinese cities. Because of that infrastructure, public services cannot be developed fast enough to cope with such expansion. And not to mention that the poor living and working environment. So you look at writing of Karl Marx, of Mark Twain, they describe the very poor living and working environment of those workers. And because of that, power began to shift. Firstly, from the castles of the feudal law to those independent city-states. And now, because of the expansion of cities into metropolitans, and then the power becomes to concentrate there. Sometimes it's political power, but more often it's economic power. That is the development of European cities in the 18th, 19th century. Whereas in China, in fact, we need to mention something that happened between 1949 and 1979 in terms of urbanization. I just mentioned briefly because we will return later when we talk about internal migration of China. Because before the end of the Cultural Revolution, in fact, China embarked on a very special policy, not urbanization, but de-urbanization. Because they discouraged the expansion of big cities, whereas for the sake of so-called national defense, they deliberately moved some strategic heavy industry from the East Coast to the central area of China, where the protection is better than in the coastal city. And so that is also the origin of the Hukou system. The Hukou system in the 50s, in fact, was being created to prevent the movement of population from the rural area to the city. Whereas from the 60s onwards till the end of the Cultural Revolution, there's also an explicit policy of moving particularly young population from the densely populated East Coast cities to the West, So China at those 30 years is in fact being a period of what we call deurbanization. Of course, there's just a general direction, but along the new railway route, there are still some expansion of big city. Whereas in the United States, the expansion of the cities take a very different route. Because cities in North America, particularly in the United States, was relatively small and backward in the 18th and 19th century. So it's quite slow compared with Europe. So if you look at the population size between London and New York, in the 18th centuries, in fact, the population of New York is just a very small fraction of that of London. So it's not until in the 20th century or later part of the 20th century, New York population overtook London. So that is also the trajectory of development of United States cities. So perhaps you may be surprised, New York is already the biggest city in the United States. But New York, its size is just a very small city in China. Because it depends on how you count it, about 6 million to 7 million people. So it's just the size of Hong Kong. And in fact, in all of those so-called cities in Europe, they are not big. London is already one of the biggest, about 6 million people. Whereas for some capital cities in Europe, they are very advanced, they are very rich. Surprisingly, the city is very small. So Berlin has only 1 million people. Stockholm also has only 1 million people, or even less than that. If you mention about Amsterdam, Amsterdam has less than 500,000 people. So they're extremely small by Asian standard. And cities in the United States are basically its expansion driven by immigration. Firstly, is immigration from Europe that go to basically the East Coast. So starting from Boston and then New York, Philadelphia. So these are the earliest so-called cities in the United States. But later on, in fact, there is a big wave of Western migration. So because of the gold rush and also because of the expansion of industry in the West, so there is a lot of internal migration in the 19th century to the 20th century to the West Coast. So that's why California has become one of the most populated states in the United States. And one thing that would have a big impact on the development of city in United States is the invention of the fourth mode of production, what we now understood as the assembly line. And because of assembly lines, you have very big factory, you employ thousands of workers on that. So of course, that's not new nowadays. But you can imagine in the early 20th century, there is a very new so-called invention. Because even if we say in England, in Western Europe, the Industrial Revolution have take shape for many decades, but the size of the factory or the size of production was relatively small or relatively small. It's not until you have the fourth so-called mode of production that you have a very big factory. And because of that, the big factory, there's a need for a big population of workers, and the cities, when it increases in population, have to expand in size. So with that, you have the introduction of all the associated logistics in moving people and goods around the city. So first you have the invention of what we call the streetcars, which is quite a little bit similar to bus service nowadays. But more important is the construction of the metro and also the introduction of automobiles for traveling, particularly for the middle class. And in cities, in fact, you're also associated with a lot of problems. So like the problem of social control in European cities in the 18th and 19th century, in North American cities, the corruption of political figures and also the sentiments against immigration and the conflict of culture between different immigration groups are major problems in the metropolitans in the United States at that time. But later on, we'll continue when we mention about the social landscape of cities. So a very short summary on that. And we trace the development of cities in the earliest social civilization. So cities exist for a very long time. But we can have a very distinct differentiation between cities in the pre-industrial eras and cities in the after the Industrial Revolution. Because in pre-industrial cities, city size and development are being constrained by its size, by the specialized neighbors it needs, by the production of surplus of food, and also connected to how the class is being organized in those countries and cities, and also the organization of the bureaucratic sort of state organization. Whereas in the industrial cities, we've just mentioned that we need to sort of correctly trace the roots of production between the invention and the introduction of technology, and also the application of technology in industry and the expansion of production, which need a lot of manpower. And those development of industrial structure have an impact on the distribution of wealth, and subsequently on the configuration of power. So that will carry on with our later discussion about the political landscape of the cities, about the political configuration in cities. So perhaps we need to consider the historical development of the cities in the context of its geography, its economic development, and also about its cultural context, particularly when we have to differentiate different routes of city development expansion in Europe, in North America, and in China. So whether they are converged or not, so it's a matter of debate. But at least at this moment, we need to trace its development along those factors. Okay, let me stop here for a few minutes and see whether you have any questions or anything that I haven't explained fully, or anything that you have some query or even disagreement. So basically, these are the contexts. Okay, if not, let us take a short break of 10 minutes and then we can resume. And remember that we have another so-called Zoom link for the next lecture. So we are not using this link. So for those who attend the lecture through via Zoom, you need to log out from this link and then enter into the next link for lecture 03. But I would keep this Zoom section alive for another 10 minutes before we enter into the new lecture. So if you have any question, you can type your question in the chat box. If not, let's take a break of 10 minutes and come back again at 20:15.